Welcome to Forbes Newsroom. Joining me now is Nassau County Legislator Josh Lafazan. Josh, thank you so much for joining me.
Brittany, thanks for having me on the show.
Of course, Congressman George Santos, as you know, is resisting mounting calls, including your own, to resign after admitting falsifying most of his resume and facing local, state, federal, and international investigations. You've been one of his most vocal critics in Long Island, and just last week, you launched the Where's George campaign. Tell us about that.
Sure. So as a sitting legislator representing tens of thousands of people in the 3rd Congressional District, my constituents are outraged, and I am outraged that we have an absentee member of Congress. George Santos refuses to answer questions from the media. He refuses to speak to his own constituents. And quite frankly, if George Santos won't come to the voters, then the voters will come to George Santos. So we started the Where's George campaign as a fun but serious way of saying that our member of Congress is missing in action. And if you see him, upload that picture with the hashtag Where's George. We will hold him accountable every single day in this job.
Has there actually been a George Santos sighting since you launched it?
Sure. So there were a couple of sightings. There was one, with him on the plane coming home from Washington. But what we're saying is that you don't get to lie to the voters and then have 2 years of a cakewalk. Right, George Santos thinks this story will die down. He thinks he can simply ignore the pressure. And we're here to say that every single day in this district, we are going to raise hell. It'll be a living nightmare for you, George, in this district. You do not get to hide from the people who sent you to Washington. You should resign. And if you're not going to resign, then we're going to hold you accountable locally.
Legislator, I listened to one of your press conferences last week, and you just said it again. Something that stuck out to me was you said you're going to make his life a living nightmare. What does that look like?
Sure. So George Santos, and I'm speaking directly to you, George, when we see you in the supermarket, in the bagel store, at a restaurant, in one of our communities, we are going to hold you accountable. We're going to ask you to answer for your false claims, ask you to answer as to why you won't resign. Again, George Santos thinks that this story will simply die down and that the voters and our outrage will subside. I'm here to remind you, Brittany, and you, George, if you're watching, that is not the case. George Santos doesn't live in this district. In fact, nobody knows where he lives. But let me remind him that Long Islanders, we don't give up that easily. And so we're going to continue to organize, continue to stand in solidarity, to continue to speak emphatically and unapologetically in that we refuse to accept that our member of Congress is a liar and a fraud.
And what does holding him accountable look like? There have been bipartisan calls for him to resign. Is resigning enough?
Sure. So it is not enough. It is the first step. But if George Santos is not indicted and not held accountable by the legal system, then what it says to the voters and to the general public is that some people are above the law. We have a system where the entire foundation of our democratic system is faith in democracy and faith in institutions. And part of that faith is that if somebody breaks the law, they will be held accountable, regardless of whether they're an average American citizen or a member of Congress. So he should be indicted. The campaign finance violations that are alleged are flagrant and offensive, not just the lying about his resume, but potentially funneling money, the $700,000 that he loaned in his campaign. He reported making $55,000 in 2020. These are flagrant violations of a campaign finance system put in place to undergird the integrity of our democratic system. He should resign, but he should be indicted as well.
As you said, he lied about many aspects of his resume, his family, his education, his employment, his finances, just to name a few. But in your opinion, what's the most egregious lie here?
Sure. So I've said this before. He's lied about every line item on his resume. The most egregious lie that he told was that his grandparents were involved in the Holocaust. Brittany, my grandfather was a Holocaust refugee. I learned through his stories the horrors, of folks living through that time period of the absolute generational trauma and how 6 million lives were claimed. And for him to manipulate the emotions of Jewish voters in one of the largest Jewish populations in the country here on Long Island and Queens is so morally depraved and so disgusting that I was glad to speak out with rabbis and members of the Jewish community to call him out for that lie. Even though it might not be illegal, it is entirely immoral, and it's the worst thing that he's done, in my opinion.
You're calling him morally depraved, but I want to know too, aside from just your response, what has been the response of all of those on Long Island? Did they see this coming, or do they feel completely blindsided?
Sure. So the day the New York Times story dropped, people called my office, Republicans who voted for him, to say that they are outraged, Democrats who did not vote for him and did not want their member of Congress to be a liar and a fraud. This has been a bipartisan, island-wide coalition built first of all, we tried to make sure he wasn't seated, but now that he's seated, we're trying to get him removed. The day after the New York Times story dropped, I held a press conference outside his fake Whitestone address, calling on him to resign. I did not believe, and I am pleasantly surprised that weeks later, we have members of his own party in Congress calling on him to resign. So this movement has cascaded, it has grown, it is multi-generational, multi-racial, it is Republicans, it is Democrats, it is independents. It is what I say, people of good conscience who are patriots, putting country over party, calling on him to step aside, and calling on the U.S. attorney to hurry up with their investigation.
It's definitely something that has been bipartisan, and it has been almost a 24/7 news cycle. I was saying earlier to you, 5 minutes before I came on to talk to you, I had to make sure there wasn't any new news that broke regarding George Santos. But legislator, I do want to take a step back here. You ran for the seat that he now fills. I'm curious, what were your thoughts on George Santos, the candidate?
Sure. So I ran in the Democratic primary. I didn't run in the general. And so I actually never got to meet George Santos, which I think is interesting because I've served in elected office for 10 years, 5 years on the Syosset School Board, 5 years in the legislature. To never meet him once, and I've been, all over this district, was concerning. It's almost like he was a ghost that came out of nowhere. But quite frankly, from what we read about George Santos, even before the campaign began, his involvement in an alleged Ponzi scheme, some of his statements, which were, on the fringe on the right in terms of January 6th and likening abortion to slavery. I mean, this person was a walking red flag. What's come out since has shown his moral depravity. It's shown that this is a person who is not well. This is a pathological liar, and somebody who poses a danger not only to the institution, but I believe to our national security as well.
You called him a walking red flag. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy said on Monday that he, quote, always had a few questions about George Santos's resume. What's your response to that?
Sure. I think the most unfortunate part of this George Santos saga is that Republicans in the upper echelons of the party, many knew about the extent of these lies and did not warn the general public. They put party over country and not country over party. And I think it speaks volumes about those individuals who chose political expediency over doing the right thing. And so I believe that many more Republicans did know than are admitting. And I think, quite frankly, it speaks to a system where people prioritize winning elections over democratic integrity.
I want to talk about someone else who knew something, wasn't right with George Santos's resume and finances, and that was Grant Lally. I spoke with him last week. He's the publisher of the North Shore Leader, and this is a small Long Island paper, I'm sure you know it, that broke the story of George Santos before the election, before this New York Times bombshell investigation. But it didn't get national attention. Why do you think it took until after the election for this to get national coverage?
Sure. So I think there's a problem across this country in terms of the demise of local media and local journalism, right? So many times in our history, it's been local reporters and the tenacity of those local papers to break those hyper-local stories that captivate the nation. And so we need to do a better job, not only as government, but as American citizens, of supporting those local papers, making sure, and my family does this, making sure we're subscribing to those papers, making sure that we're placing advertisements when we can in those papers. I think it's unfortunate that this didn't break at scale until after the election. But quite frankly, the fact that this has come out now, I think what we've learned is that people knew and didn't warn. and people have a duty to warn. All across this country, in every different institution, they have a duty to warn. And it's patriotic. It's putting country over party. And it's those individuals who knew and did nothing who were just as at fault as George Santos here.
And you said earlier, Republicans and Democrats alike have really been outraged by this. And keeping in mind the redistricting process that New York did face, the seat was still flipped in the 3rd Congressional District. So what type of leadership is that district looking for?
Yeah, and I've spoken about this, right? I'm a Democrat, and I'm calling on George Santos to resign. I join my Republican colleagues who are doing so. If he resigns and there's a special election, I don't know who would win, a Republican or a Democrat. It doesn't matter, right? What matters is that we have somebody of good conscience serving our district. And right now we have absentee leadership. George Santos being in Congress is not just flagrantly offensive, it hurts our district. Here on the North Shore, we need major federal money for storm resiliency and coastal infrastructure. We need the SALT deduction fully restored. We need major help from the federal government. The fact that George Santos is a pariah in the House of Representatives really endangers the welfare of this district. It means we won't get the federal funding we deserve. It means that we don't have a representative negotiating for Long Island and Queens in DC. And so not only is it outrageous that he serves, it actually hurts the constituents that I represent.
Let's say he does resign, and let's say there is a special election. Who do you think should replace him?
Sure. So I've gotten this question, and the answer is now is not the time for politics, right? That the focus should be entirely on getting him to resign, and he said he won't, which I think is outrageous, of course. And so what we have to do is encourage law enforcement, right? The U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District, or House Ethics, or the Nassau County DA, and all of law enforcement to expedite their investigations here. This must move quickly, and he must be held to account quickly. Then we can talk about politics, and you can have me back on your show. I'd be happy to talk about it.
I would love that. And let's talk about what's right next. This saga has really been unfolding for a month. What do you see happens next?
Sure. So I think that the media is cueing in on really where his criminal liability, I believe, exists, which is around campaign finance, right? He went from reporting $55,000 in income in 2020 to being a millionaire in 2022, right? He didn't just strike gold. The $700,000 that he loaned his campaign came from somewhere. And so I believe the more we hone in on these campaign finance flagrant violations, right? The fact that he has so many disbursements of $199.99, 1 cent below the threshold of having to produce a receipt. The fact that it's come out now that he's made tens of thousands of dollars of payments from his campaign fund to companies that were just originated. Or the fact that Redstone Strategies raised money under the pretenses of supporting his campaign, but never ran one single advertisement. So I think what we're seeing is the focus is on campaign finance, and I believe it's where his criminal liability is. I believe, I hope it's soon, but I believe the next phase here is an indictment.
Well, we will continue to follow the updates and hopefully have you back as they unfold. Legislator Josh Lafazan, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.